Grade my work.
General David Petraeus, thank you so much for joining us today for our Zoom leadership discussion. We appreciate it. Where are we finding you?
Arlington, Virginia, Bruce, and it's great to be with you. I've long admired the insights and the products that you and your team provide, and I feel privileged to join you.
Well, it is our great honor. I've long admired your career and both the national service and beyond. And maybe just starting there with kind of a big picture as we think about it, you've done tons of incredible things. You ran the CIA, you ran the war in Afghanistan, you ran the war in Iraq. Way back when you were at West Point, you dated the superintendent's daughter. So you've done some seriously challenging assignments. What was your hardest mission, and what do you think was the most fulfilling work you've done? So it's two questions.
Well, I was particularly privileged in the last, I guess, 11 or 12 years that I was in government service. So including the time as a director of the CIA, but before that, I had something like 6 consecutive commands as a general officer. 5 of those were in combat. And each of those was truly extraordinary. But if I had to choose one, I think at the end of the day, it has to be the surge in Iraq. That was certainly the hardest of the missions. It was an incredibly grinding experience in many respects. But it was made all the more significant when our soldiers and civilians and all our partners were able to prevent a full-blown Sunni Shia civil war, drive violence down by 85% over 18 months, and set Iraq in a trajectory that would continue in a pretty positive direction for the subsequent 3.5 years until tragically the prime minister with whom we'd brought the society back together took highly sectarian actions to set himself up for an election and tore the fabric of Iraqi society apart once again, also took their eye off the Islamic State, and all kinds of new challenges emerged. Regardless, what the members of the multinational force Iraq did, together with Ambassador Crocker's extraordinary diplomatic and development teams and our intelligence partners and Iraqi counterpartners, did was really extraordinary, and all the more so perhaps because very few in Washington thought that what was achieved would be possible.
So speaking of sectarian in Washington, part of the surge, as I recall, part of the great success was building a bipartisan support here at home to give you the go ahead. How do you think that could be reconstructed today? And how did you accomplish that back then? How much is thanks to the late, great John McCain or others?
Well, a lot is due to the great late John McCain. He and Joe Lieberman and Lindsey Graham, in truth, we used to call them the three amigos. They were the only 3 members of the Senate who truly believed in and unequivocally supported the surge. At the end of the day, I mean, what produces a bipartisan consensus is that you have results. As my dad used to say, we were talking before this started, he was a Dutch sea captain, and they can be famously blunt, as you know. And when I'd come home from school or some game or something like that, and the results weren't all that good, he'd literally just look at me and he'd say, "Results, boy, results." He wasn't interested in excuses. And frankly, when the violence started demonstrably going down and casualties went down and suicide, all these different indicators very, very clearly went down, and then very, very substantially so, and stayed down, that did indeed produce a lot more believers than we had at the outset of the surge. You may recall that there was only one or two votes stood between cloture, in other words, to get a vote. So 60 votes in the Senate, all they needed was 1 or 2 to get a vote of closure that could have constrained or perhaps even defunded the war. So the margin at the outset was very, very thin indeed. And I sensed that because Senator McConnell, who had just lost his position as the majority leader in the Senate, because that terrible November 2006 election for the Republicans, he sat me in a conference room and he brought through Republican senators one after another, and they expressed their enormous frustration and concerns about the war effort. So even before the confirmation hearing, I had a pretty good sense of how delicate the balance was there, to put it mildly, how fragile I think was the remaining support on Capitol Hill, particularly in the Senate.
So we promised a look at lots of the geopolitical questions around the world. It feels like we've got to start with China. And I suspect one of the books behind you there is a book I read a couple of years ago that made a big impression on me. A Harvard professor, Graham Allison, wrote a book called Destined for War, which took a look at 16 over the course span of world history, 16 times when a rising power threatened or was perceived to threaten a established power. 12 of the 16 times they went to war. And it's implicit in this is the question of whether the rising China, which threatens many in the West, will lead to more worrisome or dangerous outcomes. It feels pretty fraught, and I'm interested as somebody who has far better perspective, how you see U.S. China decoupling or shadow boxing playing out.
Well, it is pretty fraught. First of all, I know Graham very well and admire him enormously. I was a fellow for him at Harvard for 6 years. I interviewed him on stage in New York and in Munich on his book. And I should note that the title that you listed, Destined for War, is not followed by a question mark, something I asked him about as well. But when it comes to asking, how do you see things unfolding? I think I would fall back on the lesson I learned as a professor of the dismal science, economics, and answer, it depends. You can never go wrong with that, of course, but it does depend in this case. And I think in particular, there are many different actors in this, to be sure, but I think in particular, it depends on China's decisions going forward and whether actions that some have described as wolf warrior diplomacy, economic coercion, air and maritime incursions, et cetera, whether these are continued or are toned down. I have to confess that I don't fully understand why some of these actions have been and are being taken, as they seem decidedly counterproductive. In fact, John Pomfret, who is one of America's foremost journalists on China, had a piece in the Washington Post today that captures this paradox, and it was titled, "China's Biggest Global Foil is Often Just China." So I think a lot of this is going to be determined by how China goes forward. And certainly the Biden administration is seeking to establish strategic dialogue with them and to indeed to influence what it is that they do going forward, noting that, I, like probably everyone else, hopes that this could be as mutually beneficial a relationship as is possible.
So what's the right strategy for the United States then? How to navigate it to stay out of a shooting war without giving up on allies or values or principles?
Well, I think the biggest of the big ideas, and we'll keep coming back to that phrase, by the way, but the biggest of the big ideas and the most simple is to be firm, but not needlessly provocative. There's a lot to that. Beyond that, to pursue what I think can best be described as a coherent, comprehensive whole of governments approach with an S on the end of government there, because this should be pursued with all of our allies and partners together with the goal of influencing China on a host of issues, not the least of which involves deterring undesirable actions and avoiding misperceptions that could lead to miscalculation and conflict. Frankly, that appears to be what the new administration is seeking to do.
I'm interested in what you perceive as business's role in this, and frankly, in some other areas. I mean, you're an expert in leadership. You particularly here in the private sector now, you advise CEOs. You still advise world leaders on how to navigate, how to avoid crises, and certainly in a lot of the domestic questions, but also on some of the geopolitical questions. It feels like it may be an opportunity for CEOs to step up and lead. When I had Melody Hobson on one of these discussions, she and I were talking about how the civil rights 1.0 movement was the Union Army. Civil rights 2.0 was Dr. King and the marchers and the TV networks covering them. And she thinks we're reaching civil rights 3.0, which is going to be led by C-suites and going to be led by businesses and individuals. And I'm interested in how, as you deal with leaders, you're seeing their perceptions both of stakeholder engagement broadly and as it relates to whether it's U.S. China or the geopolitical questions.
Well, I think Melody's right, actually, as she is on a lot of things. I know her reasonably well. And, I've been really fortunate since leaving government to be with KKR over the past 8 years, to establish the KKR Global Institute, to become a partner in the firm. And of course, it's a firm that owns about 110 companies around the world. So it's not just our firm, it's all these companies that we own. And that gives you some pretty good insights into that C-suite leadership that you're talking about, which I think can have a huge impact. In fact, I would point out that KKR's founders, Henry Kravis and George Roberts, and of course, since your parents are on in particular, your brother Ken, a fellow partner at KKR, who's in charge of the environmental social governance issues team globally, and is also the co-head of the Impact Fund, which is $1.2 billion, which is going exceedingly well. And by the way, the big idea behind that fund is a complete switch of what we normally do. We've always sought to do well. You got to get good returns, or for the folks who give you their money to invest, to do well while doing good. In the Impact Fund, we explicitly want to do good while still certainly seeking to do well. And so far that is going quite well. But what they have demonstrated, I think, very impressively, and what our various CEOs have done the same, is that business leaders can make a huge difference. And not just with the traditional, these massive philanthropic actions, as important as they are, but by being adamant about issues such as achieving diversity on boards of directors of the firms we own. I mean, these are our companies, and by golly, if we want to see diversity on them, that will happen. And it has happened. Actually, it's very impressive to see it in our own firm itself. By making, you talked about cybersecurity, make that CEO's business. By promoting responsible government initiatives on a host of important environmental and social issues. Again, there is enormous opportunity, I think, for leadership in business to make a difference. That said, I think that the key when addressing such a significant issue as, say, reducing inequality, the key, I think, there has to be a very comprehensive approach, which is often the case. But in this case, one that features all elements that can be brought to bear. And I think that government action is going to be particularly significant in that case. And we may see some of that in the next big initiative of the Biden administration when it comes to various elements of the infrastructure initiative, not the least of which will be how to pay for it. And by the way, I should offer that I am truly non-political. I don't register. I will give advice to individuals of either party. I don't endorse or contribute. And I try to be as nonpartisan as you and your firm try to do, Bruce, which makes your advice even more effective, I think.
Well, we maybe get to the same place. We're not nonpartisan. We're very much partisan, but we're bipartisan. So half our firm is Republican and half Democrats, but everybody's wearing a jersey.
It seems to balance itself out pretty well.
Sticking on the, although these days, I don't know, there are a lot of shades of red more than there used to be, and at least two in blue. On leadership, something you follow closely. It's been an extraordinary last 15 months, a real time when leaders have stood out, some constructive with word, but destructive in deed, others destructive in word, but, get a few things right in deed. I'm interested who over the last 15 months has really impressed you. And this can be government, this can be global, this could be local. Who have you seen where you said, wow, they're really, that's the way you lead?
Well, let me describe what I believe is an intellectual construct that's useful for evaluating leaders, particularly strategic leaders. So those at the very top of an organization, an institution, a unit, whatever it may be, who have to make the truly fundamental decisions about which way they're going to go. And there are 4 tasks that a strategic leader has to get right. First, they have to get the big ideas right. Second, they have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization and outward to stakeholders, potential clients, customers, et cetera. Third, they have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. And fourth, they have to determine how to refine the big ideas to do it again and again and again. And this is laid out. In fact, it was one of the projects with Graham Allison at the Harvard's Belfer Center when I was a fellow there. There's actually a website that we built all about this. So if you take those 4 tasks and then evaluate who has done particularly well as a strategic leader, especially, in performing those forecasts. I think the individual who really stands out is the Federal Reserve Board Chairman, Jerome Powell. He very much got the big ideas right about the money supply, how to expand it, the purchases of assets, the provisions of loans, and all the rest of that. He got interest rates right, and he has also gotten forward guidance right. And the impact of what he has done has been absolutely enormous. And among the most significant reasons why the U.S. will come out of this better than many other countries, after actually stumbling quite a bit in terms of combating the pandemic for quite a period of time, will be undoubtedly because of what he has done as the strategic leader of the Fed.
I hope you're right. I worry. I know there was the old Weekend at Bernie's joke about Alan Greenspan that Senator McCain famously made in the debate. But in retrospect, some of how we dealt with the tech bubble back then inflated the housing bubble, and there is. I worry about a ongoing rising debt, inflation risk, can kicking of each. The way we avoid this disaster is to make the next one probably that much greater. But to be honest, we need Henry McVeigh, the chief economist for KKR, on here to really help us plumb that. I think you're right. He's communicated very well. Powell has.
Well, it helps if you become a modern monetary theorist.
Yeah.
In which case you won't be worried about debt. The truth is, it is easy to be a modern monetary theorist as long as interest rates stay low. That, of course, depends quite a considerable degree on what you think will happen with interest rates, whether you're on the Harry Summers side of this or actually on the side of the Secretary of the Treasury, the administration, and including Fed Reserve Chairman Powell. Only time will tell on that. I tend to believe be more with the latter than with the former. But again, that is going to be a crucial factor going forward. And certainly at some point, we're going to have to come to grips with what will be a vastly higher debt to GDP ratio. And we're going to have to undertake measures to start getting that ratio going down in a responsible manner, particularly if the economy comes back as significantly as it appears is going to be the case.
Yeah, I was not an economics major. I was a history major, which probably explains why I just don't buy into MMT for sure. This may have already happened, but don't talk out of school. But if the Biden administration, if the new president said, General, given your career, I'd love your advice, domestic, foreign, just whatever you think. What's your advice to me as the president? And again, I don't know if you actually had a conversation, because then you shouldn't share private conversations. But generically, how would you advise this president at this point in history?
Well, it's an interesting question because it tends to make one think that, you ought to offer what you have some comparative expertise in. And I think that is in doing what I was doing, particularly my last decade in uniform, dealing with what are now known as endless wars. And I think that the big idea about ending endless wars is to keep in mind that you don't end an endless war by ending U.S. involvement in it. You end it by achieving some kind of durable way forward. And it may be, in fact, that you can't end American involvement in it. What you can do is sustain an involvement that is sustainable, and that's measured in terms of expenditure of blood and treasure, and manage the problem. We have seen what happens if you pull your forces out. You lose your influence, you lose your situational awareness, you lose your capabilities on the ground. Something flares back up, and it's very difficult, again, to get back in. And we saw that, of course, most significantly with Iraq. I'm currently quite worried about the way forward in Afghanistan. Look, nobody wants to end endless wars more than those who have actually fought them and know the cost and sacrifice that's entailed in these. But we have figured out in recent years in particular, because of the advent of this extraordinary constellation of drones we can put in the sky, the capacity that we have for precision air attack and intelligence fusion, that what we can do is we can advise and assist and enable host nation forces, and they do the fighting on the front lines. They restore basic services. They reestablish local grievance resolution mechanisms, governance, repair damaged infrastructure, and so forth. And we did that, for example, in Iraq and also in Syria, supporting the Iraqi security forces and the Syrian democratic forces, and enabled them on the front lines to eliminate the Islamic State caliphate from those two countries. Certainly, there's still a threat from the Islamic State, but now it's in terms of insurgents, terrorist cells. They can deal with those with our assistance, and we should maintain that assistance and not take our eye off that ball. But my sense is that we would be better off if we just made a sustained commitment that is sustainable. Keep in mind, in Afghanistan, we have not had a loss in combat in the past year. Surely we can maintain 5,000 troops along with, say, 8,000 or more of our other coalition partners' forces with that constellation of drones that helps us enable the Afghan security forces that are on the ground fighting. Keeping in mind, we went there for a reason. That's where the 9/11 attacks were planned, when al-Qaeda had a sanctuary on Afghan soil under Taliban leadership. And I have no assurance whatsoever that the Taliban would prevent al-Qaeda from reestablishing a sanctuary like that. And very likely the Islamic State would try to do the same. Unfortunately, they have an affiliate in the Afghanistan-Pakistan area as well. Absolutely the focus of our military, and indeed of all of our capabilities, the main effort should be on the U.S. China relationship, again, together with all of our allies and partners together. That is the most important relationship in the world. And again, we want to be absolutely certain there are never misperceptions or missteps that erupt into conflict there. But we can do that while easily maintaining, again, handfuls of thousands of troops who are especially configured and supported to enable those on the ground to deal with what is a generational struggle, unfortunately, and that is the threat of Islamist extremists. That is not going away. You can't study it until it goes away. It doesn't. You have to do something about it. What happens there doesn't stay there. It's not under Las Vegas rules. It tends to spew violence, extremism, instability, and a tsunami of refugees, not just into neighboring countries, but all the way into Western Europe. And in the case of Syria, caused the biggest domestic problems that are, since the end of the Cold War, that our partners and allies there have had. So I think that would be what I would seek to discuss, noting that I have had that conversation with our chief executive some years back when he was the vice president, and also with a number of the individuals who are around him, which I think is a very, very talented team, by the way, and also a very experienced one, and one that I think did learn from some of the actions during the Obama-Biden administration.
That's serious advice. I know the president doesn't drink, so I don't know if that's good or bad, given that advice. You know, you mentioned swarms, General, and I've read recently a few things that have piqued my interest, some suggesting that swarms of drones may be to warfare what previously the machine gun was, and then what air power was. You know, a true paradigm shift that we've only just begun to see, but that revolutionizes the ability of how forces fight and how supremacy is achieved. I can't think of anybody better to ask the question of than you.
Well, that has been one of the huge developments over the last 20 years. I remember when we did the invasion of Iraq, when I was a two-star general commander of the 101st Airborne Division, you know, there's literally one drone, one Predator, period. It wasn't even an orbit. It was one, and we were all fighting for it to get the feed and to look at what we wanted to look at. The picture was pretty grainy. Now you have dozens and dozens of unblinking eyes over battlefields. And of course, then you'll have swarms. But the real development that is coming along that's going to transform warfare is basically going to be unmanned systems in general. We will have unmanned ground systems. We'll have unmanned air systems, many, many more than we have now, and much more sophisticated. We'll have unmanned systems at sea, in the undersea, and a variety of devices, all of which are going to be enabled by machine learning and artificial intelligence. And the big development with which we're going to have to come to grips is the reality that the person in the loop may not be, when it comes to deciding to pull the trigger or not, the person in the loop may be in the development of the algorithm that creates the conditions that must be met by the machine, which increasingly is going to do better at facial recognition, gait recognition, you name it, all kinds of ways of recognizing an adversary. And we may give it the weapons-free command or something so it can shoot on its own. But if we actually hold up and we're going to press the button to allow it to pull the trigger, our unmanned system will be dead because the other side will get it first. This is going to be transformative. And you can see pretty easily a day when what is going to be fighting on battlefields is going to be machines, robotics, and of course in cyberspace as well, where frankly that battle is already ongoing, in many, many cases prosecuted again by algorithms that people have developed, but which are now doing it on their own and of course increasingly learning and gradually even employing artificial intelligence to make it even more effective.
Makes one worry, though. It's obviously not having soldiers and men and women in on the battlefield and dying and getting harmed is positive, but do we lower the threshold of going to war? If it's my
Sure.
machines against your machines, maybe
Yep.
less deterrent for me to go.
No, that's one of the ethical and normative issues with which we're going to have to deal. Frankly, it is different to use a drone, frankly, as a military commander to take out an enemy than it is to put your soldiers into harm's way and risk and all the rest of that. We believe that we have done this responsibly, that we have done this in a way that, again, observes rules of engagement and so forth. But at the end of the day, again, the more that machines are fighting machines, the less it could be that the constraints will be that apply to that.
So you referenced working with other nations, and I know the new administration is very keen on putting the band back together, multilateralism. And it raises a question that often when reading Ian Bremmer's wonderful weekly thing, I think about, which is whether the architecture for multilateralism that we need in the 21st century exists. The UN Security Council is based on a world war that ended 76 years ago. And NATO is based on a Cold War that ended 30 years ago, if you count it by the the Soviet Union going away or dissolving. It doesn't feel like any of them were purpose built for climate or for cyber or for data and data sovereignty and data risk. What are your thoughts on whether we need a separate architecture or whether the NATOs, the UNs, the WTOs can shift their focus and their thinking to be more 21st century relevant?
Well, I think that we have to make the institutions that exist, however frustrating, however ineffective at times, however maddening, dealing with them and through them can be. And I'm a creature of these I was the chief of operations for the United Nations force in Haiti, not the U.S. Force. I was a NATO commander as a 1, 3, and 4-star general, often dual-hatted with a U.S. command. But again, I've grown up with these organizations. I recognize the challenges with them, the inherent inability at time to make decisions that one country can veto, can stymie all the others and so forth. At the end of the day, though, I really come back to what Churchill used to say about coalitions. And he used to say that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without them. And having led the largest actual combat on the ground coalition in history, which was in Iraq, over 60 countries when I was privileged to command the coalition and our forces there. Again, it's tough. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of time to coalition sustainment, alliance management, all of this stuff, again, can be maddening, but it can also be very, very helpful. So clearly, the US is very much intent on reinvigorating, re-energizing a lot of the different coalitions and alliances around the world. I do think that is the right approach and is commendable, but we have to just be prepared for, again, endless frustrations, noting that, again, this is the best that we're going to get because to create new structures, in many cases, requires the same kinds of compromises that brought us to the structures that we have today. There could be some certainly brought new, the D10, this democracy coalition that has been bandied about. There are others that could be formed for dealing with issues that surrounds cyber, a variety of different cyber activities, trying to have some kind of arms control in cyber activities, particularly with offensive actions, noting how challenging that would be and how difficult to verify, and what would you do if it's violated, et cetera, et cetera. But again, I think that there is goodness in trying for these, as long as you don't have expectations that are overly lofty, because if you do, I'm afraid they're going to be dashed.
So first, just as a process matter for those scoring along, we're going to stop by 12:45 to give the general 10 minutes before whatever Leslie has you doing next, and anybody who wants to grab a quick lunch, as I hope to do. Number one. Number two, if you have questions you'd like me to ask, put them in the chat, please, and I'll try to pick a couple. You had a great Churchill quote, although first, I love Churchill quotes, but it makes me start thinking he kind of had one quote he just reused in a lot of ways. So the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others ever tried. Americans always do the right thing after trying everything else. Turns out the guy was a one-trick pony. I
no. There's a Churchill quote for every occasion and every event and every endeavor. I've got lists of them.
Hey, you mentioned cyber, and I spend a lot of time trying to think about it's a fraught area, and one that, it's in some ways we're almost lucky that this is a natural pandemic that didn't touch the digital, given how much of our lives are now clearly based on digital, as opposed to something that if it wiped out all of our digital systems and data, would have caused more harm. Some have talked about the need, Brad Smith at Microsoft in particular, for basically a Geneva Convention for cyber. And you're right, even if you had one, verifying and proving who did what makes it a little bit more difficult, so that some have questioned its effectiveness. Others, though, have said the reason we wouldn't want to be in a cyber Geneva Convention is because our offensive capabilities as a nation are the best in the world, and witness Stuxnet. And so it always worried me that I'm more worried about the fact that we are the most digitally exposed as opposed to the most digitally powerful. I didn't know if you've spent time thinking about that, or have an opinion on whether take our offensive capabilities off the table loses more than we might gain by protecting ourselves, or would there be no protection?
Well, first of all, by the way, don't anybody who is watching when I nodded over Stuxnet, do not take that as an indication that the U.S. was in any way involved in Stuxnet, please. Keep in mind that I was the director of the CIA at the time. So just hypothetically, if something like that had taken place, it would have been in the covert action realm, which of course is something that we never discuss. First of all, I think it's very important to observe that, the past 15 months have been the best of times for cyber and everything virtual and digitization and all the rest of that. But it's also been the worst of times, because the way we have operated has opened up all kinds of new vulnerabilities. We've had some of the worst hacks ever. Microsoft Exchange, SolarWinds, just two of the most well-known in recent weeks and months. Of course, ransomware attacks have been off the charts. Cyber crime now is yielding trillions with an S on the end of it every year, which makes it one of the top 10 or so economies of the world if it was aggregated. So the challenges have very much grown during a period in which we have come to depend ever more on connectivity and on a variety of different digital tools. You ask, should we give up our offensive capabilities? Of course, the answer is no. Again, that is an area of comparative advantage, but as you rightly know, we're also in the glass house. So we have to be very careful how we might throw our cyber stones. I do think that Brad is on to something. I know him and highly respect him as well. He's on the cutting edge of some of these kinds of debates, and I've heard him discuss this. And I think there is value in thinking about how we might get the most capable of those in the cyber realm. So you're talking obviously Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and some others, at the very least to agree to not take down each other's electrical grids, or hospital systems. Again, there's a handful of different activities that one might be able to agree should be off limits. Now you'll say, okay, well, that's fine. They'll keep them off limits until you get into a tough spot, and then they're going to take down your grid because, and you know that they've conducted cyber reconnaissance in our electric grid, which does happen to be the case. But I still think there is some value in pursuing that, but then there's also value in having the capability to respond in kind, if necessary, when it comes to that. Noting again, the problem is that we are both the most capable and the most vulnerable.
My in the questions, my friend Jeff Farah from the Venture Cap Association asks about your perspectives on In-Q-Tel, and I'll throw in IARPA as well, where there are public-private partnerships with the intelligence community tapping research, whether at universities or in the case of In-Q-Tel, seeding companies.
I am a massive believer in In-Q-Tel. For all the others, In-Q-Tel is this is all publicly known. It is a private, nonprofit, federally funded, and the funds traditionally came through the CIA venture capital firm. It is a brilliant idea, first of all, because it finds solutions to problems that are being experienced inside the fence, behind the fence at the agency. Now it's in the other agencies of the intelligence community, and now it's other countries' intelligence organizations as well, several of the others. And there are now platforms. We created a platform. It's not just in Arlington, Virginia, where the headquarters is, but also a platform that we created when I was the director in Silicon Valley. And I believe now there's one in London and in Australia as well, to give you an idea of who some of those partners might be. The beauty of In-Q-Tel is that by investing in the startups that are also providing solutions to problems inside the wire at the agency, is that they also make great returns from that. The first $1 million investment in Palantir, for example, was from In-Q-Tel. And what's so good about that is that you can afford to hire among the best people in the business. I'm sure they're still not quite getting what they might get in Silicon Valley, but they're doing good for our country, which is not inconsiderable compensation as well. But as an example, the very talented CEO of In-Q-Tel, who's still there, when I was the director of the CIA and he was the CEO, I think he earned 6 times what I earned at that time, and he deserved it. Of course, it's not hard to earn more than the director of the CIA, but I think our daughter did it with a startup in food, fun, and fitness or something as well. But again, I like that idea. I think it's fantastic. You should take. I am now a private venture capitalist as well as a partner at KKR, and that's all approved by our compliance. Needless to say, I have pushed the idea for the Department of Defense. DARPA is fantastic. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or whatever it is, they have enormous sums of money, vastly more than In-Q-Tel, orders of magnitude more. They essentially give it away. Now it's to support very important projects and so forth, often to reward winners of competitions. It has done massive good. ARPANET was, the internet is an outgrowth of that, just as Google Maps is an outgrowth of some other government-funded initiatives. I wish, though, that they could take a stake in it, because I'd actually like to see the same kind of model that is used by In-Q-Tel used somewhere in the Defense Department, so they're just not giving money, they're actually investing money. And there's something about investing that just causes you to have a slightly different perspective. And you could then ideally hire and retain the very, very best people in that particular sector, the ones that you're interested in. And I just think, again, there's a lot to be said for that. That model is a really good one. And In-Q-Tel continues to do so well that multiples of the dollars, for every dollar that In-Q-Tel puts into a startup, immediately others follow. They're just watching what In-Q-Tel does. And they know, of course, that if In-Q-Tel invests in a firm, there's at least one customer somewhere in the intelligence community for it. And that's a pretty good sign. So again, a very, very good model, I think, and one that I wish we could see more broadly, particularly in the Department of Defense. It requires those special authorities and a variety of different legislative agreements to support that.
Thank you. So 2 questions left. First, black swans. What are people not paying enough attention to that you think about and that you worry about, but that, you know, it's not China, it's not even cyber, because we're paying a lot of attention, even if they're really hard. But what's out there you wish there was greater focus on by whether it's business leaders or government?
Well, of course, if I can envision it, then it wouldn't be a black swan. Although I should note, in truth, the pandemic, the risk of a pandemic has been one of the top 10 threats on the annual intelligence community's annual threat assessment for a number of years. And it is not apparent that we obviously internalize just how devastating it could be. Right now, I'm increasingly concerned that although we talk about this, I'm not sure we're doing enough in response to it. And that is the idea that none of us is safe unless all of us are safe. In other words, it's great that we are getting vaccinated. It's hugely beneficial for the country, but we got to get much more serious, I think, and at least planning to provide vaccines to developing countries. And also, frankly, to focus more attention on those countries that had pre-existing economic conditions before the pandemic hit as well. I'm really concerned that there could be enormous collapses in certain countries and continued major problems with the pandemic. We're just seeing, in fact, a rise in India and Pakistan that is very concerning. And of course, if we recognize the causes of movements of refugees, migrants, asylum seekers, and all the rest of that, and increasingly challenge, not just for the United States, but for many other countries as well. This is what you do to prevent that from getting even worse.
It's a great point. So final question. We always try to end these asking our guests for give us some reasons for optimism. You know, as you can't say the vaccine because everybody says the vaccine, because we're all optimistic about the vaccine. But what gives you hope for the future that you've seen over the last year that makes you feel like, challenges notwithstanding, things will get better and we will solve problems?
Well, again, beyond the actions of the Federal Reserve, I guess, and also beyond the fiscal support packages by the previous and present administrations supported by Congress, which have been very, very decisive, even though one of them took an awful long time. But what I think gives me hope, as always, is the drive, the determination, the ambition, the innovativeness, and the creativity of our younger generation. In addition to being a partner at KKR, as I mentioned, I'm also a personal venture capitalist. I'm also an academic. I'm a member of a number of think tanks and numerous veterans organizations, and each of those provides vantage points that allow me to see the generations that are following ours. And in particular, again, to see leaders of existing businesses, founders of startups, exceptional students, and also members of America's new greatest generation, those who volunteered to serve in uniform following the 9/11 attacks, knowing that they would be asked to deploy to combat. And there are countless individuals with whom I'm privileged to interface on a daily basis who are truly inspirational and give me not just energy, but enormous hope for the future. And it's individuals like these, I think, who have repeatedly made America and our world great again and again. And again, they are what give me tremendous optimism and hope for the future.
Petraeus for president.
Yeah.
General, thank you so much for making time available today. We really appreciate your thoughts. I hope you and everybody on the call has a great rest of the day and week. Thank you.
Privilege is mine, Bruce. Thank you.